Well, good morning. We're still not at Matthew yet, and we probably won't be. I was trying to figure it, but probably another 2 to 3 weeks we won't be to Matthew. But we're actually not going to go very far in time today. We're going to stay still for just a little bit, and we're going to talk about a few things. Some of the things were asked about last week, so we'll dive into some of those. But what we want to talk about first is Disneyland. No, yeah. Actually, I do want to talk about Disneyland, but one of my favorite rides in Disneyland, and it's really not because it's a thrilling ride, but it's because I guess it's a meaningful ride. It's a Small World. You know, you like that one. I like It's a Small World. You know, it's not a thrilling ride at all. It's very peaceful. It's relaxing. It's kind of nice after you've been walking around Disneyland, Disney World for a while. But one of the things about It's a Small World is you get to go through each of the rooms, these big rooms, and you see the variety of cultures that comprise this globe that we live on. And especially in the last 100 years, how much smaller the world seems than it used to. Does it feel like that to you?
Pretty well.
Yeah. Let's talk just a little bit about, let's just go back 150 years. I know 150 years is before any of us lived. Where was America 150 years ago? We were at war. With whom? Each other. In the 1860s, we were duking it out with each other. What was life like back then? Hard. Okay. In what ways? Okay.
No medicine.
Okay. We had less health care. We had less amenities. Running water was hard to come by. Cars did not exist at that time. Airplanes did not exist at that time. Telephones didn't exist at that time. That's a good thing, Frank says. I'm sorry? No electricity at that time. Firearms were pretty minimalistic at that time. What else? What was life's? No gas, cooking gas, that's right. No air conditioning. Wow. That's one-room schoolhouses.
The church is the cultural center for the family and the community.
The church was the cultural center of family and community. Yeah, on Sunday, what happened in communities? Now communities weren't close, right? I mean, if you lived near a community, you might have lived several miles outside, right? And so when you went to church, did you go to church for an hour and leave?
All day.
It was an all-day affair, wasn't it? Yeah. You had picnics, yes. You had meals on the ground because you couldn't go back home or you couldn't go to the restaurant. Yeah. That's just 150 years. Jump forward to some of your childhoods. What was life like in your childhood? Let's just say again? You didn't have TV?
We had a black phone hooked to the wall.
A black phone hooked to the wall. Yes, and at one point in time, you didn't dial directly, did you? Party line. But before that, you even called an operator. You remember your phone number? Okay.
I can't remember anything else.
Well, what was your phone number? 75.
And that was to my mother and dad at their restaurant.
Yes. Okay.
96, please.
96.
75.
Wow. 2326. Yes. You remember Pearl Harbor Day. Now, that's almost 100 years from where we started in our conversation. And what did America look like at that time? Let's just say 1940. coming out of a recession, but we were a world power. Less than 100 years from when we were duking it out with each other with very little accommodations, very little amenities. In 70 to 80 years, we were a world power.
We didn't have TV back then.
In the 40s?
Not till 1948.
48? Okay, you had radio because Roosevelt did all of his things on radio, fireside chats, yes.
We were in church when we grew up.
Yes, and by the 40s, we had electricity.
Most travel was done by train.
Most travel was done by train, but there were some in society that had cars. Henry Ford had already done his thing by then, and he was churning out the cheap cars. You could have them any color you wanted as long as it was black. You remember that? Yeah. What else by the 1940s?
Well, this started in World War II.
World War II. You had already gone through one world war. Okay. What happened in the 20s?
Prohibition.
Prohibition, okay, Prohibition. Before we had the recessions of the 30s and the Dust Bowl days. Isolationism. Oh, that was big, especially in the 30s and 40s. What was Roaring 20s. The 20s was a huge cultural change, wasn't it? Huge cultural change. We had so many innovations in the early 1900s. It totally changed life. Electricity, cars, running water. I mean, not everybody had to go to the outhouse at that point in time. You had all of these innovations that totally changed the lifestyle of Americans. Women got the right to vote early on in the 1900s, absolutely. And to a larger extent, those who were slaves became a more integrated part of society. Now, as we talk about that, we move on into the 60s. What happened in the 60s? What kind of things happened in the 60s? What? Drugs? Okay. Only in the latter part?
Yeah, in the first part was really...
Kind of calm, kind of...
It was quite calm, because I was in Columbia University, I was in ROTC, and you could wear your uniform and be real proud. And all
Yes.
that. By, the latter part of the 60s.
Yes.
All the same.
Military was respected in Korea.
You didn't want to wear your uniform.
That's right. That's right. Korea was fine, but Vietnam wasn't. And that changed a lot of the mental context for a lot of people, a lot of the culture.
I've heard it said that periodically in our nation's history there were spiritual revivals,
Yes.
and that we were due for another one in the 60s. But instead, what captured the nation's attention was politics as centering around the Vietnam War.
Yes.
Spiritually, we never quite recovered from that.
We didn't. And I think even today we are struggling to find our path. JFK was shot. What else happened in the 60s? And I totally agree. And I think we're still en route for that. We're still, millennials are still searching for who they are. You had the Generation X, Generation Y, latchkey kids trying to figure out who they were as people, how they fit in society. And now we have technology to such an extent that I, as a parent, am having a hard time figuring out how to parent in an age where everyone has one of these things, kids included, and access to everything. Integration in the 60s? What else happened in the 60s? Beatles. Okay, Beatles. Now, wait a minute. Where did the Beatles come from? England. We loved England at that time, didn't we? Bring your culture over. Wait a minute. 200 years before that, we were like, we want nothing of you. How things change so quickly. What else did we do in the 60s? Way far away. Space race. We landed on the moon. Now, 100 years prior to that, would anyone have fathomed that we would actually walk on the moon?
Jules Verne and nobody else.
In his own mind, that's right, yes. How things change. That was 100 years from the Civil War to landing on the moon. And today, in the 60s, 50s and 60s, is when all this got started. Most people didn't. But the military, the internet, all of the big computer systems started in the 50s and 60s. One of my favorite movies, I know this is weird. I'm a younger fella, but I like the older movies. There's a movie with, it's Katharine Hepburn and, I can't remember his name. Spencer Tracy, I think. It's called Desk Set. Yes, love that movie. I do. But it's talking about how computers and technology is affecting our lives. He was a efficiency expert. Yes. Yes, they stacks of cards, stacks of these punch cards. That's right. Yes, and if you got them it fed in wrong, or if they spit out and fell on the floor, you were toast. That's right. So, starting in the 60s to where we are today. Now, if you think about rapid changes from 1860 to 1960, we really accelerated the pace of change from 1960 to today. The pace of change has really accelerated. We have gone from black and white TVs to color TVs to Walkmans and CD. I mean, I remember even in my lifetime, I worked in a music store and we sold tapes. And you guys are familiar with the 8-tracks. The only 8-track I had experience with was an old motorhome that actually had an 8-track in it. But you still have some? Okay. Records, cassette tapes. Yes, the 78s, that's right. And people today wouldn't even, they might know what a record was, but if you talk about a 78, what the heck is that? Yes.
Just remember, the book of Daniel ends with Daniel being told, go your way until the latter days when travel and education will be greatly increased.
Yes. We want to talk about that. That's actually where we're headed. And no, that is perfect. That's
I saw a news report just a couple weeks ago, and they're wanting to build this new airliner. Travel, what was it, 3-4 times the speed of sound.
Oof.
15 times the speed of sound.
It'll get you from here to London and just,
A lickety split.
yeah.
Wow.
And I'm going.
Yeah. I went to a museum in Philadelphia. It was a traveling exhibit. But I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I love Star Wars. Now, I'm not one of those guys who live and breathe Star Wars, but I really enjoy Star Wars. Although the last movie kind of put me off. But I went to an exhibit in Philadelphia that was paralleling what you see in Star Wars, the technology that's exhibited in Star Wars, to actual technology today. And it was phenomenal. It was talking about, the little hovercrafts that they had in Star Wars, and the trains that they have in Japan that hover on the tracks based on magnets, and that they're super accelerated and they're safe and whatnot. It was just amazing. The robots, the droids that you see in Star Wars, and the robots that we're building today, and how that robot changes our lifestyle.
We had movies about spaceships before.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there were lots of space-oriented movies all throughout time. Buck Rogers, that's right. So, we, in our world, have experienced cultural shifts, have we not? We have experienced cultural shifts. And we have only, in our experience, we've only talked about 150 years. Now, if we step back and go to the time period we've been talking about, we are talking about thousands of years, all the way from the time of Saul, all the way up, remember. Hundreds of years when we're talking about Babylonian captivity, all the way through the Greek and Roman empires. All the changes that might have existed. Now, another thing. If you think about, let's say, Native American tribes. I just chose one. I could have gone anywhere in the world. Native American tribes. What was the scope of their culture? The scope of their life? If you were Cherokee, or if you were Apache, or Navajo, what was your locus of, not control, but locus of control, orientation to life? Was it worldwide?
Just your hair.
It was just your local area, maybe the size of a few states. Probably not even that much.
The government made you live.
Until another power came in and enforced a different perspective. Okay? Like the Trail of Tears. Absolutely. Different powers come in and enforce a different perspective, right or wrong. It's a new way of seeing the world. It's exposing you to something different. In Saul's time, King Saul, King David, the sphere of perspective, I'll call it, was pretty small. They didn't reach out. I mean, all across the globe, you had tribes of people. You had small groups of people. Probably the biggest were in Asia, looking at Mongolia or China. But for the most part, the area we have we're concerned with, the scope or the vision of life was pretty limited. It begins to expand as we see these certain populations having greater aspirations to power. And it begins, more or less, Egypt has always been kind of wanting power, but their power has still been fairly localized. Really, until the Assyrian Empire, we don't see a great expanse of perspective, a great expanse of control. And so it was really easy for all of these nations to have their own language. It was really easy for all these nations to have their own bit of commerce. And you didn't do trade very much with other people. When you did, it wasn't through coins, through money. You traded, you bartered. I'll give you my goods, you give me your goods. There was no economic system per se. Even when Solomon brought in all of his riches from the Asia and other places, it was more of a bartering system. And gold and silver did have their merits. But every economy had their own weighting system, how much gold meant to them. So then we get the Assyrian Empire and the expansion and the connection of all of these various tribes and peoples. And the relationships start to grow. Perspective starts to change. Then we have Babylon. Babylon comes in and once again tries to expand territory and reach out and touch even farther out in the world and bring their vision and their culture to other people. So they're changing things. Remember we talked about the language change to Aramaic. Okay? When these countries start affecting the people around them, their culture starts to change. Then we get the Grecian Empire, the Macedonians and the Grecian Empire to a much larger extent. I'm sorry, I skipped the Persians, didn't I? The Persians had their say in things and wanted to affect the world. But the point is, Until these experiences, people were pretty limited in their scope of life. But now we're starting into a time period where we're looking at empires, not just a local empire, global empires. And the global empire is setting the stage for something that God may be playing a part in. If you want to take the word of Jesus, the message of the gospel to the world, it's hard to do when everyone has their own little perspective, right? If you want to take the message of Jesus to Africa, the little known towns in Africa, they're still living in a smaller, many of them are still living in this small perspective, excluding the world around them. So how do you get that message into that small tribal area? You've got to talk their language, speak their language. The globalization of a single empire is helping promote the message of the gospel. So while there's bad things about the expansion of these empires, there are also good things about the expansion of these empires. So I want to kind of talk a little bit about how did Hellenism is the word that we call the Greek cultural experience, the changing of people's lifestyle into one of the Greek lifestyle. So how did Hellenism affect the people across the world? And then specifically, what were the challenges that Jews had with Hellenism? Okay, so that's kind of where it's been 30 minutes. That's where we want to start. But I think that's good. It's good for us to relate this. We ourselves have experienced change. And now we're talking about the change that might be experienced by a Jewish person because of some of the cultural experiences around them. So let's talk about some of the circumstantial changes right quick. Let's go back down. Persia was an empire. Alexander the Great swept across Persia. Alexander didn't last long. He left no son to rule. And so when he died, his empire got broken up into pieces. Now, it was still a Grecian empire per se, meaning the cultural context was Greek. It just was no longer the Alexandrian Empire. Because it got divided up. And here's, again, our little map. And you have Egypt down here. You've got Greece over here, and this is the Mediterranean. Greece over here, Asia Minor here with Syria and Palestine, and then you've got Babylon over here. So it got divided up among different generals or different powers. Okay, so Ptolemy got control of Egypt, and technically he got control of some other stuff too. But once everybody started duking everything out, you actually had a division that looked kind of like, I'm going to say that. Ptolemy controlled Egypt and part of the Palestinian area, Palestine. This area came under Seleucid control. Seleucus was one of the people eventually that took control. So between Ptolemy and Seleucus, these areas, we have some conflict, and we'll talk about that. This is kind of forgotten for a while. But you had two other generals that got the Grecian areas and the Turkish areas, the Asia Minor areas. So now we have this world in Palestine that is under Greek control, but it's a divided control. Where do I want to go with this? This happened in about 327 BC-ish is when Alexander died. Somewhere around there, if I'm remembering right, it's somewhere around that date. It's actually probably 320. I think 333, 331 to 3. It may even be 319 is when he died. So, and then around 300 is when they finally settled down and figured out who God was. I could be exact about that, but it really, I'm not too worried about the dates at this point in time. For about 100 years, this area was Ptolemaic, meaning Ptolemy had control of this area. Under Ptolemy, the Jews actually did pretty well. Now, Ptolemy did take a whole bunch of people from Jerusalem back down to Egypt, but Ptolemy, the first Ptolemy, is said to have been very interested in arts and literature and culture, and he was interested to know about the Jewish culture. And it's said that he was the one that promoted, remember we talked about the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Scriptures? He was the one that promoted the translation of the Greek Scriptures the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. They also had a fairly good relationship with Jews, Egypt's to Jews, and during this time, some of the Jews were set up as soldiers. And they were actually supporting the military outposts of Egypt. And we talked about that a few weeks ago, where it's been discovered that there were temples and communities, Jewish communities, on the southern ends of Egypt where there were border skirmishes. And so the Jews helped out with their border security. So this is probably the time frame where that happens. Alexandria was a really big cultural center, and a lot of Jews settled in Alexandria. And now all the way back from the Babylonian Empire, remember Jeremiah and some others migrated down, Jeremiah against his will, but they migrated down to this area. That was before Alexandria existed, but they were in the area. And then when Alexander conquered the world, he set up the city called Alexandria, and it became a very big cultural center. And so you have a very big population, a Jewish population in Alexandria, Egypt, as well as other parts of Egypt. You also have a big population of Jews up here in Asia Minor. A lot of Jews during these captivity moments, and then they migrated. Once you no longer have a homeland, where do you go? Does it matter? So a lot of people thought, I don't really have a need to go back to Jerusalem per se. Yes, religiously speaking, Jerusalem is still the center of my focus, but my life is not centered around Jerusalem. I could easily live here, or I could live here, or I could live here. And if you live outside of Palestine, do you think you might get affected by the world around you? Most likely. Very likely. And so what we see is we have Jews throughout the world who have encountered the cultures around them. At this time, the culture around them is Greek. And again, I think this is part of God setting up His plan. When Paul does his missionary journeys, who does he go to? Say again?
The Jews first.
He goes to the Jews. He goes to the synagogues. He goes to the synagogues in all these little towns. But then he starts teaching the Greek people. So he's setting up, God I think is setting up the expansion of His world, His good news, way back before Matthew ever starts. Okay, so along about 200 BC, we'll get to this. This is when we start to incur problems and issues with Palestine. But before we get there, let's talk about culture under the Hellenistic ideals. Okay, some influences of Hellenism. Hellenism, I mean Greek influences. When I talk about Hellenism, that's the term that is used for the spread of Greek influence. Okay? Commerce. Remember, we had talked about commerce being very localized prior to these larger expansions of empires. If you want to be a world power, and if you want to participate in the world power, you have to have a single language of commerce. In the world today, what is the primary commercial monetary unit? The dollar, the U.S. dollar. Now, China's trying to change that. But today, the U.S. dollar is the worldwide monetary baseline. And that helps because when you go to Egypt today, when you go to France today, when you go to Japan today, everyone understands the dollar. Not only do they understand the dollar, but because you are using an American system of commerce, the biggest percentage of the world knows what language? English. If you go to the streets in Cairo, most of the street vendors will be able to speak English because they know they're going to have visitors from America or England or some of these larger powers that speak English. Australia speaks English.
Not very good.
Not very well? Okay. But English is well known across the world, primarily because English is the language of commerce across the world. Go to the Greeks. Greek language becomes familiar to everybody because Greek monetary system was the language of commerce across the world. It's a lot easier to participate in the world around you when you speak the same language, both verbally and commercially. Okay, so it was a big thing. One of the things also with commerce, what kind of lifestyle did, that's probably not a good, what kind of vocation did the majority of people have in the Old Testament? Okay, fishermen, farming, agriculture. Okay, so you had wildlife, you had agriculture. You didn't have many people as marketeers. You didn't have commercial exchanges in the same way in the Older Testament. Now, in this time, more people had the opportunity to become merchants. And so you see the rise of what's called the merchant class. People who never had that, well, opportunity is the word, opportunity to enter into an exchange with other people and trade their goods for monetary systems, or within the monetary system, now have an opportunity to do that. You could now sell goods as an individual to people in Alexandria. As an individual, I could now sell my goods to people in Asia Minor. I had a lot more opportunity if I just go to Jerusalem to market my wares. So you have the rise of a new class of people that are now merchants. Merchants were a big thing in Greece, in the Grecian culture. One of the things that the lifestyle changes, because you had this middle class merchants that now had this new lifestyle, you had a lot more luxury and leisure. There was a lot more leisure time. And let me read you just a little bit about one of the historians that wrote way back then, if I can find it here in my notes. I'll get to it. Here it is. I'm going to massacre his name. Posidonius? Yes, that guy. Ancient historian. This is one of the things he said about the cultural lifestyle, and he was really writing it just to express the way of life and how it might differ from other ways of life that you might encounter at the time. So, Hellenistic city, think Alexandria. These big Grecian central locales of culture. The people of these cities are relieved from their fertility of their soil. Okay. No longer are they bound to their agricultural business. They're relieved from the laborious struggle for existence. Life is a continuous series of social festivities. Their gymnasiums they use as baths, where they anoint themselves with costly oils and myrrhs. Now, prior to this time, who were the rich people for the Jews? The kings, the royals. They were the ones with the money. And then you did have the people who had business in the temple, but that money was God's. Okay? You can see how this lifestyle is different. They now have money for their own costly oils and myrrhs, and they can lather themselves with them in the baths and just while away the day. In the Grammatia, such is the name they give to the public eating halls, they practically live. So they live in the diners of the day, filling themselves there for the better part of the day with rich foods and wine. And then, much that they can't eat, they carry away home. They had doggy bags. They took them home. They feast to the prevailing music of strings. The cities are filled from end to end with the noise of harp playing. It was a life of luxury. It was a life of art. It was a life of theater. It was a life of philosophy. When you're not in the field 24/7, 7 days a week, trying to work your fingers to the bone in order to make a living, what do you do with your time? What do you do with your mind? That's the cultural context. So we have this rise of the merchant class. We have the rise of libraries. Remember the library in Alexandria, vast library in Alexandria. Unfortunately, it burned years later. But they collected all of this knowledge from across the globe, learning from each of these cultures. They established schools of philosophy, schools of moral, schools of life. And so there were lots of educational opportunities in the Grecian culture. Sculpture, fine arts. We know the theater was huge in the Grecian worlds. Now, theater was not well accepted by the Jews. So, when Jesus called the Jews hypocrites, does anyone know the root of the word hypocrite? A hypocrite was a play actor. A hypocrite was the word that you said when you represented a person in the theater who would play a part. So they portrayed themselves as someone else that they were not. So what you had is they might stand in the theaters, they might stand behind this rock or this backdrop, and they'd put on this mask, and then they'd come out and they'd play a part with this mask in front of them. And then they'd go back behind the backdrop and they'd put on a different mask, and they'd come out and they'd play a different part. Same person, playing a different part. And then at the end of the show, they might take that mask away and you'd see who the actor is, who the hypocrite is. Hypocrite was an actor, okay, in the Greek play. But when Jesus called the Jews hypocrites, he's saying you're an actor. You're not real. You're not showing yourself to be who you portray yourself to be, or who you really are inside. There's a phrase we have today in the computer world called WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. WYSIWYG. And so if you're working on an application and what you see, that's the features of the application. And there's nothing going on behind the scenes. Jesus was calling them to be WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. But what they were being was different. They were being actors, hypocrites, Greek theater. Theater was really big in the Grecian society. That's when you start seeing all of these Roman theaters built. They start out as Greek theaters before the Roman Empire. They start out as Greek theaters. Another really big thing was the gymnasium. The gymnasium, the Greek idea of health and physique was big. Our Olympics today comes from this Greek idea. Does it not? Where does the Olympics hail from? Where do they bring that torch from? Olympia. Greece. They were really promoting, I'm going to call it field sports at the time. And one way that they did this, the Olympians, the people who participated in the gymnasium, did so in the nude. Yeah. Boy, that would really help you work on your physique, wouldn't it? If everyone could see the way you were shaped. Now, as the Jews encountered this, if you were a young Jew and you wanted to participate in the gymnasium and you were doing it in the nude, what is one factor that you grew up with that's different than the other people? Circumcision. What you had was a lot of Jews would go through surgery to hide their circumcision in order for them to assimilate better into the gymnasiums. These are some of the effects of the Hellenistic culture. And you can see why there was a growing contingent of very Orthodox Jews that resisted the Hellenistic culture. They didn't like the direction this was going. It was changing their kiddos. It was changing their neighbors. It was changing their parents. And if you were a devout Orthodox Jew, this was a hard pill to swallow. I love photography. I still say I'm not very good at it. But in photography, you have multiple lenses. One lens is a wide lens. It lets you see a wider perspective of the world around you. And you can take a picture that includes a lot of aspects within your vision. Another lens is a telephoto lens. And what it does is it limits what you can see. And it helps you zoom in on something very specific. And it helps you cut out any of the distractions that might enter your picture. Down here, they're using wide-angle lenses. They're trying to figure out how can they incorporate the world around them into their vision, into their perspective, and have a Jewish experience that also includes their cultural environment. There are some people up here in Palestine that are using telephoto lenses. They don't want to see the world around them. They don't believe that the world around them is what God wants them to see. They're zooming in on the law of God. They're zooming in on what they believe is true and wanting to exclude all the distractions that is the Greek influence. That can be a good thing. But it's interesting to see how all of that plays out in the next couple of centuries. Okay? So that's where we're headed. We have a lot of people, primarily here, I keep going back to Alexandria because that is one of the largest groups of Jews, and it's one of the largest affected groups of Jews. People up here were also affected, but they weren't nearly as good about writing about their experience. They weren't as good at portraying the world around them and integrating the world around them into their vision of religion. These guys were. They were prolific writers. Let's see. Where do I want to go in the 3 minutes we still have? I really did intend to go with 2 other topics today. I had 3 topics to talk about, and one of them was where we had come from last week when we asked the question, what was the content of the Hebrew Old Testament? When we talked about the Septuagint, and the Septuagint was the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, well, what did that contain? What was the Hebrew Old Testament? Really quickly, I'll run down that to give you a little bit of insight, but then we'll pick up there again next week to detail, I think it might flow into the next topic of conversation. So let's talk really quickly about the Hebrew Old Testament. The Hebrew Old Testament is often referred to as the Tanakh. Tanakh. I think I spelled that right. Tanakh. Tanakh. And it represents 3 parts: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Those are the 3 parts of the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures. Now, we know what the Torah is. What is the Torah? The first 5 books. The first 5 books of law, today we call them the books of Moses. Okay? The first 5 books were the law of Moses the law of God given through Moses, and that was the foundation of the Hebrew religious experience. Now, I said Hebrew religious experience. When we start talking about the Jews, remember what happened in Babylon. When they went to Babylon, they no longer had the temple. They became a people of the book, and they had to interpret that law in various ways, and they created what we know of as the oral law. The oral law was the interpretation of the 5 books. Okay? So you had the law, you had the oral law that eventually became part of what we know of today as the Mishnah. And then later, you have the commentaries, which is another part of the Mishnah. The commentaries on the oral law, which is trying to interpret the real law. Okay. So the Torah, the Nevi'im is the prophets. The Nevi'im, not Navi'im. Nevi'im is the prophets, Nevi''im. At least I think that's how we refer to it today. Starting with Joshua. Joshua, Judges, and then it has Samuel, and then the Kings. Those are called the former prophets. And then you have all of the minor prophets. Well, I'm sorry, you have 3 major prophets. You have Isaiah. The former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then you have the latter prophets, which include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets that we know of today. That composes or comprises the Nevi'im, the section of Hebrew Scripture called the prophets. And then there's a third part called the Ketuvim. The Ketuvim is really other books. It includes poetry, Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. It also includes the 5 scrolls. There's a thing called the 5 scrolls, the Hamish Megalat, or I'm sure I massacred that, but the Hamish Megalat. The 5 scrolls are the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Those 5 books are read at various times throughout the year in the Jewish service. Okay? The 5 scrolls are read in the service throughout time. Kind of like in Christianity today, we have the liturgical cycle, the liturgical series, where you read parts of the Gospels during the year. So those 5 books. And then something just called other books. Other books include Book of Daniel, Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the Chronicles. So that's the breakdown of the Hebrew Scriptures. We'll talk about it again next week, and we'll kind of go into those a little more in detail, but we'll also talk about this thing called Seferim Chitzonim, books that are outside, meaning other books that aren't contained in what they believe would be legitimate books for the Hebrew religious experience. Today we call those the Apocrypha. So we'll talk about that next week as well. So we'll hit on this again next week. And it's important because the Septuagint includes these books. That Greek, when you talk about a common language across the world, you got people here, you got people here, you got people here, you got people still in Babylon. All of them are speaking Greek. Not many of them know Hebrew. Not many of them know Aramaic anymore. So you need a translation that talks to other people. That translation, they may have already tried to translate something, but now the Jews need a legitimate single source translation. And that's what the Septuagint is proposed to be. And I think that's why we get that exceptional story. Remember the exceptional story we have about the 70 people go in closed rooms and they come up with the same translation, all of them exactly alike? No one believes that to be true. But we believe that to be propaganda that promotes the idea that this is the legitimate scripture that is now the universal scripture that can be used across the globe. It unifies the Jewish readings, the Jewish experience, into what used to be Hebrew, but now it's a Greek book. And so if you're going to point to Scripture, you point to the Septuagint. You don't point to that version or that version or that. You just say, I'm reading the Septuagint. I'm reading the legitimate copy. What a lot of people today say the King James Version is. Just laying that out there. Okay? So that's important stuff for us. So we'll revisit that again next week. Let's go to God in prayer.